I've actually made multiple community polls asking One Piece fans what is the single greatest feat in the story, but the scene that always wins these polls is something called the knot. This option not only wins with an overwhelming amount of votes, but it even beats feats by characters One Piece fans for years believed were the strongest. But what actually is the knot? The name of this attack alone sounds very strange, where if this were another battle manga, you would expect the strongest attack in the story to be named something cool or epic, not something as ordinary as a knot. The knot in One Piece refers to a moment that happened in chapter 1122, when a robot called Emmet managed to stop the five elders by untying a piece of rope that was inside his body. But this was no ordinary rope. Centuries ago, this rope had been infused with the strongest haki of a legendary One Piece character called Joyboy. But when the knot was finally untied on Egghead Island, the entire surrounding area was engulfed in Joyboy's Conqueror's haki. This blast of haki not only knocked out almost every single marine in the vicinity, but it de-transformed all of the elders and sent most of them right back to the Holy Land. But in addition to this, Joyboy's haki from beyond the grave was so powerful that it even left Imu shaking and screaming, despite him in this moment being far away from Egghead Island, in the safety of his own castle. There is a really strong argument to be made that the fans who voted on the polls I showed earlier were actually right, as this scene may genuinely have showed the pinnacle of power in the One Piece story. But there is also an argument that this is not true, but that this feat may actually be incredibly overrated. So, was this truly the best feat in One Piece? What I think is inarguable is that the knot is the best use of Conqueror's haki ever shown in the story. There's three specific things in this scene that make this a very clear-cut case. The first is Joyboy's haki being able to knock out vice admirals. The second is the sheer distance it was able to cover. And the third, and what could surprisingly be the most impressive detail, is it being able to turn off the five elders' transformations. But let me give some actual context as to why these three things make this the greatest Conqueror's haki moment in the series. Joyboy's haki being able to knock out vice admirals was not only the first time this has ever happened in One Piece, but it was also the first time that Conqueror's haki was able to knock out haki users period. With essentially every other Conqueror's haki blast, the only characters who get knocked out are complete weaklings. This is pretty well shown in what is arguably the second greatest Conqueror's haki moment in the story, which is when Roger and Whitebeard clash during their final fight. Despite their Conqueror's haki being strong enough to shake an entire island, even the clash between these two legends only made the weakest pirates in the area lose their consciousness. This scene very deliberately shows that all of Whitebeard's top guys were still perfectly fine, despite them at this point still being literal teenagers in their early pirating years. This is however no mark against Roger or Whitebeard. This same thing happens pretty much every time Conqueror's haki is used in the story, where even the strongest very regularly fail to knock out non-combatants. But this only shows how uniquely powerful Joyboy's Conqueror's haki was. The Marines his haki knocked out were not just haki users, but they weren't even regular vice admirals. These were vice admirals stationed in the New World, which is the most dangerous sea on the planet, that is mostly controlled by the world's strongest pirates. Vice Admiral Doll in particular showed that she was far stronger than vice admirals we've seen in the previous story, where she for example was able to overpower a Mark III pacifista. She was also able to dominate the giant warrior pirates, who despite being pre-time-skip characters, are for whatever reason now really strong in the final saga. Yet Joyboy's blast still took out Doll and every other vice admiral on Egghead, putting it cleanly above any other case of Conqueror's haki being used in this manner. The second aspect where Joyboy's Conqueror's haki beats everyone else's was its sheer range. While I just went over Roger and Whitebeard with their Conquerors being able to affect an entire island, Joyboy's blast went far beyond this. In the panel where it was depicted, the scene is zoomed out way further than with any other Conqueror's haki blast in the story. When we've seen other characters split the skies, the haki lightning effect often goes off the island, yet only just a little bit, but not so with Joyboy. After Emmet untied the knot, Joyboy's haki blasted so far off Egghead that the panel does not even show the lightning's end point. Range has arguably for a long time been one of the main indicators of how strong a character's Conqueror's haki is, as for example, Luffy's range with this ability has steadily gotten bigger and bigger as he has gotten stronger. No matter who you compare it to, the panel of Joyboy's haki blasting off the island goes way further than any other scene like this in the story, no matter if we compare it to Roger, Whitebeard, Rox, the Yonko, or even Imu. The third and final special thing about Joyboy's knot is what I think a lot of fans may have honestly overlooked, which is it being able to both de-transform the elders and to also send the summoned ones back to Marie Joyce. When the Egghead arc's climax first happened in the manga, this was only a minor detail, but with new information from the following Elbaf arc, the fact that Joyboy's Haki was able to do this has actually become something incredibly impressive. We've now in Elbaf seen that just using Conqueror's Haki on characters who've been summoned through the Abyss is not enough to actually send them back. Even after Kappa and Peace Saint summers up with his Conqueror's Haki, Summer still stayed on Elbaf, even though he had come to the island via the magic circle. What could however arguably be even crazier about the knot is that Joyboy managed to force the elders back to their human forms. This is because the manga has now shown that on God Valley, even after Saint Saturn took a massive combination attack from the island's strongest Conqueror's Haki users, unlike on Egghead, he still stayed in his transformed state. This is genuinely nuts, as Joyboy being able to turn Saturn to normal, while these God Valley characters didn't, could genuinely mean that Joyboy's knot had more Conqueror's Haki than all of these God Valley characters combined. This is because of what Roger himself said on God Valley. When fighting Shebek, Roger explained that the way Haki works comes down to mass, where he thought that only a combination attack of him and Garp using all of their Haki could be enough to turn Shebek back to normal. In other words, the amount of Haki used actually gets combined when characters attack at the same time. With the same logic, because the amount of Conqueror's Haki used in this God Valley combination attack was not enough to turn Saturn normal, there is a legitimate argument to be made that Joyboy's knot alone held more Conqueror's Haki than all of these attacks put together. I don't however want to go further with this point. Saturn in this scene is being used by Imu, so it is rather unclear how this would affect him being able to maintain his transformation. This does however speak to the larger theme with Joyboy's Haki. Essentially, with all these 3 points, the reason why the knot is such a special feat is because Joyboy's Conqueror's Haki was visibly able to do things no other Conqueror's Haki user has in the story. But does this actually make it the best feat in One Piece? While Joyboy having superior Conqueror's Haki compared to all of these other legendary characters is very impressive, the blast itself really isn't that effective when it comes to combat. Even if it devoured the elders or knocked out the Vice Admirals, the Haki blast didn't actually do much damage. Characters like Saturn and Kizaru still appeared perfectly fine even after withstanding it, as this is just how Conqueror's Haki works, where it only really does damage when it is coated in attacks. I think this is honestly a very fair argument to make, why this shouldn't actually be viewed as the best feat in One Piece. If we go by raw damage, the knot handily loses to other abilities in the story, such as the Bash Rang gun. Still, I think the argument with the knot is more so that the thing that truly makes it such a noteworthy moment is that it's proof of how ludicrously powerful Joyboy must have been. The manga has made it pretty clear that depending on how strong a character's Conqueror's Haki is direct evidence of how strong they themselves are. This was said all the way back at the end of the pre-time skip, where Rayleigh explained that Conqueror's Haki cannot be trained and only gets stronger with the user. We've also seen this firsthand. After first learning how to do Conqueror's coating, Luffy still handily lost to Kaido in just a few chapters. But when he later returns, and is actually able to split the sky with his Conquerors, Luffy is also able to give Kaido the toughest fight he's had in years. In other words, the knot as an attack is not really the thing that is insane, but I think the reason why fans view this moment so highly is because it is evidence of Joyboy being far superior to pretty much every other character that we've ever seen in One Piece. But there is also another way to look at this topic. There are actually legitimate counter-arguments to some of the points I brought up earlier, which may well suggest that Joyboy is not actually the strongest character we've seen in the story. One point is very interestingly about range, where the knot may have not actually been the most distance a character has been able to cover with their Conqueror's Haki. At the end of the Wano arc, Shanks' Haki is shown being able to travel all the way from the shores of the island to its very center where Green Bull was fighting the samurai. Wano is not only one of the biggest islands in the story, but it is situated at the top of an incredibly tall plateau, which means that Shanks' lightning did not even travel a vertical distance, but had to jump up and down to reach Green Bull. We also have no idea just how far off this plateau Shanks' ship was at this point, where the only detail we know is that it was somewhere nearby. Because of these details, there's actually a legitimate argument to be made that Shanks' Haki was able to cover an even greater distance than Joyboy's. For a more semantic point, Dorian Brokey also did not actually say that Joyboy's Conqueror's Haki was definitively stronger than Shanks's. On a purely literal level, the only thing they say is that it could have been stronger. This could mean any number of things, from Shanks and Joyboy's haki being very close, to Joyboy's actually being considerably better, or even the unthinkable, of Shanks actually having stronger haki. I'm not necessarily endorsing this view, but I'm just pointing out that the comment is actually very vague. While on the topic of range, I should also probably address that even though Joyboy's haki shook Imu, this by no means indicates that the haki itself reached the Holy Land. The manga has made it very clear that Imu can telepathically absorb the characters who've been bonded to him. This means that more than likely, Imu was simply absorbing the egghead battle through the elders, and that this is how he was able to witness Joyboy's haki. Imu's reaction itself is also something worth addressing, where despite how hysteric it is, it also does not necessarily mean that Imu is weaker than Joyboy. This is something that actually happens a lot in One Piece, where characters can carry trauma to a point where it even gets triggered when they're the stronger party. The best example of this is probably that even someone as strong as Kaido was traumatized by Oden to such a degree that facing Oden's mere retainers 20 years after their fight was actually enough to trigger Kaido's trauma. We have also seen this in the final saga, where Rayleigh by himself is able to terrify Blackbeard, not because he was stronger, but because Teach was much weaker the last time they met. This gets proven when Rayleigh himself admits that he couldn't possibly beat Blackbeard in the current day, because there are so many examples like this in the story, where even the strongest can be rattled when someone hits the right nerve. Imu's reaction genuinely does not tell us much about how strong he is compared to Joyboy. For what it's worth, it's also very much in character for Imu to be this expressive with his emotions. This is not just with Joyboy, but Imu at this point very regularly loses his cool, even when facing weaker characters. Having said this though, there is actually a strong case to be made that Joyboy is still stronger than Imu, at least when it comes to Conqueror's haki. Imu's Conqueror's is also ridiculously strong, where it was able to cover the island of Elbaf, which is actually far larger than Egghead, but on top of this, the monster trio Gaban and Loki were all in genuine awe at Imu's haki. Yet there is a very easy argument to be made that Joyboy's Egghead haki display was still superior. Imu's haki on Elbaf was able to knock out some of the giant warrior pirates, yet it is deliberately shown that it wasn't able to knock out Kashi. This is incredibly noteworthy, because Kashi on Egghead was actually beaten by Doll, who as I brought up before, was herself knocked out by the knot. Ergo, Joyboy's haki has been shown to be able to knock out stronger characters than Imu. Still, I wouldn't go too far with this argument. Joyboy said that he had put his strongest haki in the knot, but we really do not know if this was the case with Imu on Elbaf, where he could have simply been using a smaller amount of his haki. For all we know, Imu may not even be able to use his haki at full power when he is possessing Kungo's body. So, the best thing that can be said about Joyboy is that his Conqueror's is only so far shown to be stronger than Imu's. If you want to disqualify the knot as being the best feat in One Piece because it does not actually do much damage, or for any other reason, I would actually argue that by default, the honor of having the best feat in the story should surprisingly go to Imu. More specifically, to Imu's feat of turning Rocksteady Zebek into his loyal demon with Domi Reversi. In terms of combat, genuinely nothing else compares to this in the whole story. Rox is one of the strongest One Piece characters ever, yet Imu was able to beat him in just one move. But not only beat him, Imu as a massive bonus also turned Zebek into his obedient puppet, who was even more powerful as a demon than he ever was as a human. In other words, Imu with this feat does more quote damage than any actual attack in the story. Plus, it also tremendously increases Imu's own power by giving him a free ally. I would however still be cautious with treating Domi Reversi as some unbeatable ability, since this is also something that happens a lot in One Piece, where a lot of abilities at first seem invincible before their weakness is eventually revealed, and this even recently happened with Regeneration, where in less than 50 chapters after Egghead, Regeneration has already become far more beatable than the story showed in the previous arc. One very interesting thing about this scene with the Haki knot is the reason why Emmet decided to use it. Emmet right before this actually realized that Luffy was not Joyboy, where he decided to help Luffy for his own sake. Yet this was only after Luffy revealed that he belonged to the D clan. The reason why Emmet had confused Luffy for his old friend was not just that Luffy had eaten Joyboy's devil fruit, but that according to Emmet, Luffy physically looked exactly like Joyboy, even though he had been born hundreds of years after Joyboy's death. But I actually think I know why this is the case. If you're interested, you can click here to watch this video, where I break down why Luffy looks exactly like Joyboy, but also why this is the likely answer Vegapunk was about to reveal about the Will of D. Thank you to all my members for their treasure. I hope you are all enjoying the season's festivities. As always, I'm really grateful to everyone who watched this video to the end.